The wedding invitations were beautiful, cream cardstock with elegant calligraphy. Sarah carefully addressed each envelope, a smile on her face as she envisioned her friends and family receiving them. Soon, she would marry the love of her life, and she couldn't wait to celebrate with everyone they held dear. As she picked up the next envelope, her smile faltered. It was addressed to Mark, her fiancé David's best friend since childhood. A knot of unease tightened in Sarah's stomach. Mark had been a constant source of tension in their relationship. His jokes at Sarah's expense, his dismissive attitude towards her opinions, and his tendency to monopolize David's time had created a rift between them. Sarah had tried, for David's sake, to be tolerant, but Mark's behavior had chipped away at her sense of security and respect. Now, faced with the prospect of him attending their wedding, a wave of dread washed over her. The thought of him sitting there, potentially making snide remarks or pulling David away from their shared moments, filled her with a deep sense of unease. It felt wrong, having someone at their wedding who brought her so much discomfort, someone who seemed to diminish her place in David's life. The weight of the decision pressed down on her. Should she voice her concerns to David, even though she knew it would put him in a difficult position? Could she bear to bite her tongue and pretend everything was fine, sacrificing her own peace of mind for the sake of appearances? The perfect day she had envisioned was suddenly marred by a difficult choice, one that forced her to confront the complexities of loyalty, love, and the boundaries of tolerance in a relationship. David and Mark's friendship was deeply ingrained in their lives, dating back to their shared childhood in a small, close-knit town. They had been inseparable through thick and thin, sharing secrets, dreams, and a bond that seemed unbreakable. Sarah understood the significance of their history, the unspoken language and shared experiences that connected them on a level she couldn't fully access. However, as Sarah became a more significant part of David's life, she began to see a side of Mark that troubled her. His humor often veered into insensitivity, particularly when it came to Sarah's career aspirations and her close relationship with her family. He would make light of her ambitions, dismissing them as cute or impractical, and roll his eyes at her frequent calls to her mother. At first, Sarah tried to brush it off, attributing it to Mark's dry sense of humor and his discomfort with change. She reminded herself that he was just being protective of his best friend, wary of anyone who might disrupt their dynamic. But as time went on, the subtle digs and dismissive comments chipped away at her confidence, leaving her feeling like an outsider in her own relationship. The more time they spent together, the more Sarah realized that Mark's behavior wasn't just harmless teasing. It stemmed from a deep-seated resistance to her presence in David's life, a reluctance to share his best friend with another person. And what hurt Sarah the most was that David, despite witnessing these interactions, rarely intervened. There were countless incidents that Sarah tried to rationalize, telling herself she was being overly sensitive. There was the time Mark had made fun of her taste in music at a dinner party, causing her to retreat into embarrassed silence while David chuckled along with him. Then there was the Christmas gathering where Mark had presented David with a ridiculously expensive gadget, knowing full well that Sarah and David were saving for a down payment on their first home. Each incident, seemingly minor on its own, added to a growing sense of discomfort and resentment. Sarah found herself dreading their encounters, her stomach churning at the thought of enduring another round of backhanded compliments and dismissive remarks. She started making excuses to avoid spending time with Mark, opting out of social gatherings and suggesting alternative plans. The situation weighed heavily on her mind, casting a shadow over her relationship with David. It wasn't just about Mark's behavior anymore. It was about David's passive acceptance of it. Sarah yearned for him to recognize the emotional toll it was taking on her, to stand up for her and acknowledge the disrespect she endured. She craved the reassurance that her feelings mattered, that her place in David's life was valued and protected. But David, caught between his loyalty to his best friend and his love for Sarah, seemed unable or unwilling to confront the issue head-on. This silence, this unwillingness to acknowledge the problem, created a rift between them, a silent barrier erected from unspoken resentment and unaddressed hurt. One evening, as Sarah and David were preparing dinner, the tension that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. Sarah had had a particularly stressful day at work, and Mark's constant calls and texts to David, demanding his attention, had pushed her to the edge. As David ended yet another call with a dismissive, "He's just checking in," Sarah finally snapped. The words tumbled out of her mouth, a torrent of frustration and hurt. She told David how disrespected and insignificant Mark made her feel, how his constant needling and dismissive attitude had chipped away at her self-esteem. Tears streamed down her face as she described the emotional toll it was taking on her, the way it made her question her place in David's life. David, taken aback by the intensity of her outburst, seemed genuinely surprised. He stammered, trying to reassure her that Mark didn't mean anything by his words, that it was just his way of joking around. He insisted that Sarah was overreacting, that she needed to be more understanding of his friendship with Mark. His words, instead of comforting her, only fueled her anger. It was as if he hadn't heard a word she said, dismissing her feelings and minimizing the impact of Mark's behavior. That night, they went to bed angry and distant, the chasm between them widening with every unspoken word, every unacknowledged hurt. The conversation, instead of resolving the issue, had only served to highlight the deep divide in their perspectives. In the days that followed, an uneasy silence settled over their relationship. David continued to talk to Mark regularly, but the easy camaraderie they once shared seemed strained, punctuated by long pauses and forced laughter. Sarah, still reeling from the argument and David's dismissive reaction, withdrew further into herself. She felt unheard, unseen, her feelings invalidated by the person she loved the most. The thought of Mark's name, once a source of mild annoyance, now filled her with a visceral dread. The wedding, once a symbol of their love and commitment, now felt tainted, a looming reminder of the unresolved conflict that threatened to overshadow their happiness. The silence stretched on, punctuated by stilted conversations and awkward silences. Sarah desperately wanted David to understand the depth of her hurt, to acknowledge the impact of Mark's behavior and the pain his inaction caused her. But David, trapped between his loyalty to his friend and his love for Sarah, seemed paralyzed, unable to reconcile the two. He vacillated between placating Sarah with empty reassurances and defending Mark's actions, minimizing the hurt he inflicted. His inability to take a stand, to choose her side and set boundaries with his friend, chipped away at the foundation of trust and security that their relationship was built on. As the weeks turned into months, the unresolved tension surrounding Mark cast a long shadow over their wedding planning. Sarah found it increasingly difficult to focus on seating charts and flower arrangements, while the issue of Mark's presence loomed large, a silent elephant in the room. One evening, as they were reviewing the guest list, Sarah, unable to bear the weight of her unspoken feelings any longer, finally voiced the thought that had been swirling in her mind for months. "David," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't think I can have Mark at the wedding." The words hung heavy in the air, the silence stretching between them like a taut rope. David's face contorted in a mixture of shock, anger, and betrayal. "What do you mean you don't want Mark at the wedding?" he asked, his voice tight with disbelief. "He's my best friend, Sarah. He's been there for me through everything." Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the difficult conversation ahead. "I know he's your best friend, David," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "But he's been disrespectful to me, time and time again. He makes me feel small and unwelcome, and I can't imagine celebrating our love with him there, casting a shadow over everything." David's initial reaction was explosive. He accused Sarah of being controlling and unreasonable, of trying to dictate his friendships and rewrite the history they shared. He argued that it was his wedding too, and that he couldn't imagine celebrating such a momentous occasion without his best friend by his side. The argument escalated, fueled by months of suppressed emotions and unspoken resentments. Sarah, exhausted from trying to make David understand, finally broke down, tears streaming down her face as she pleaded with him to see things from her perspective. "It's not about controlling you, David," she cried. "It's about protecting our relationship, about creating a safe and loving space for us to start our marriage. I deserve to feel respected and valued, especially on our wedding day, and I can't have that with him there, constantly undermining me and our happiness." As the night wore on, the initial anger gave way to exhaustion. They sat in silence, the weight of the ultimatum hanging heavy in the air. David, his anger spent, finally seemed to register the depth of Sarah's pain, the years of accumulated hurt reflected in her tear-stained face. The conversation, though painful, marked a turning point, forcing them to confront the unspoken issues that had been festering beneath the surface of their relationship. The following days were tense, filled with difficult conversations and introspective silences. Sarah, despite standing her ground, couldn't shake off the feeling of guilt and worry. Had she been too selfish, too demanding in her request? Was she asking David to choose between her and his best friend, a choice no one should have to make? David, grappling with the ultimatum, withdrew into himself, seeking solace in long walks and solitary evenings. He was forced to confront the reality of his friend's behavior, the subtle ways in which Mark had disrespected Sarah, and the role his own inaction had played in perpetuating the situation. He realized, with a pang of guilt, that he had been so caught up in preserving the sanctity of their childhood bond that he had been blind to the pain it inflicted on Sarah. He had chosen loyalty over love, protecting his friend at the expense of his future wife's happiness. The realization was a painful one, forcing him to reevaluate his priorities and the kind of husband he wanted to be. He knew deep down that Sarah was right. Their wedding day, their future together, should be a celebration of their love, a sacred space free from negativity and disrespect. The decision to exclude Mark from the wedding was not an easy one, nor was it made lightly. It stemmed from months of accumulated hurt, unaddressed disrespect, and a growing disconnect between two people who loved each other dearly. It forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about loyalty, love, and the boundaries of tolerance in a relationship. It underscored the importance of open communication, of creating a safe space where both partners feel heard and validated. It highlighted the need for mutual respect, not just between partners, but also within their respective circles of friends and family. Ultimately, the decision came down to a simple but profound truth. Love requires choosing each other, even when it's difficult, even when it means having uncomfortable conversations or setting boundaries with those we hold dear. It means prioritizing the well-being of the relationship above all else, nurturing it with respect, understanding, and unwavering support. The wedding, though slightly delayed, went ahead without Mark. It was a beautiful celebration of love, filled with laughter, joy, and the unwavering support of their closest friends and family. The experience, though challenging, had brought them closer, forging a deeper understanding and appreciation for the precious bond they shared.